This is your daily real estate syndication show. I'm your host, Whitney Sewell. Today, we've packed a number of shows together to give you some highlights. I know you're going to enjoy the show. Thank you for being with us today. Wherever that may be, you're trying to become a more effective leader. I am anyway. I assume most of you probably are also. Our guest today is going to help you do that. And guess what? It's going to be through storytelling. An organized storytelling, right? Paul Smith is one of the world's leading expert on organizational storytelling. He's one of Inc. magazine's top 100 leadership speakers of 2018 and the author of 3 Amazon #1 bestsellers, Lead with a Story, Sell with a Story, and the 10 stories great leaders tell. In addition to Parenting with a Story and his newest work, 4 Days with Kenny Tedford. And a part of his research on the effectiveness of storytelling, Paul has personally interviewed over 300 CEOs and executives in 25 countries and documented over 3,000 individual business stories. That's allowed him to reverse engineer what works in storytelling and what doesn't. Paul's trained executives and international giants like Google, Hewlett-Packard, Ford Motor Company, and many others. I heard Paul speak at a couple conferences I was at and got to meet him and was just very impressed by his ability to lay this out, right? And obviously he's put the work in to figure this out. And now, thankfully, he's willing to share that with us. And you're going to hear, 10 great stories that you need to have to become an effective leader. And it's going to help you to think through them. Right? It's going to take some time to figure this out, but he's going to help you to break that down too. And over a few days here, we're going to help you to become a more effective leader by telling great stories. This is your daily real estate syndication show. I'm your host, Whitney Sewell. Our guest today is an expert in storytelling. I've heard him speak a few different times at some conferences, and I am so grateful to share his knowledge with you, the listener, today. And so, Paul, welcome to the show.
Yeah, thanks for having me on, Whitney. I'm excited to be here.
Yeah, honored to have you. I've learned a lot from him just from the couple times I've heard him speak, and I'm looking forward to this. Paul, telling a story is so important, right? Or being able to tell it well. It's something I've tried to learn, and I feel like I've not spent enough time on myself to really think through what that looks like when I'm trying to express a story or talking about, even somebody says, who are you, right? What is that story that I'm trying to tell? And I know in our business, it's so important, as in almost any business, right? But, when we're building that trust and relationships or specific things, we want people to know about us, right? Or we want them to know about our business. And we don't always know how to express that well. And so I'm looking forward to diving in today. Paul, who are you? And let's dive in a little bit of your story and how you became an expert in storytelling. And then also, why is it so important, even in our business, that we know how to tell stories well?
Yeah. So, to that first question about me, I certainly haven't done this my whole life. My first part of my career was pretty typical corporate career path. I studied economics in undergrad. I got a master's in business, spent a couple of years as a consultant at Accenture. But I spent most of my career at the Procter & Gamble company. So 20 years at P&G in various different jobs and levels of leadership positions. I've worked in manufacturing plants and with marketing teams and on sales teams. And in my last job, I was the head of consumer research for one of our major global business units. So consumer insights. But along that way, I just got fascinated with this concept of storytelling. And I think one of the reasons was because I slowly but surely recognized that it was an important skill to have if I wanted to be an effective leader. Yet nobody taught me how to do that. They didn't teach me that in undergrad. They didn't even teach me that in business school. I didn't learn that at Accenture. They didn't even teach me that at Procter & Gamble. It's just something you just kind of notice, that leaders who are really effective tend to have this ability to tell these great stories. So I just kind of set off on my own little personal learning journey. I started interviewing the leaders I thought who were particularly good at it, first inside the company and then outside the company. And along that journey of me trying to learn, and of course, I bought all the books I could, read everything I could about storytelling, still didn't know how to do it. And that's when I really started interviewing people. And along that way, it occurred to me that if I want to know this that badly, maybe there are other people who do as well. And so it stopped just being my own little selfish learning journey and became an idea for a book. And so I continued to interview people outside the company. And at this point, I think I'm up to 300 or so CEOs, executives, leaders, salespeople, marketers, et cetera, and hundreds of companies and in 25 countries around the world. And that's the research that has become the basis for the books that I've written and the courses that I teach. In fact, each person I interviewed probably has told me 8 or 10 or 12 different stories. So if you do the math, I think I've documented around 3,000 individual stories. And so that's how I became interested and developed some level of expertise in storytelling, is just starting out because I wanted to know how to do it. And I think I got a pretty good handle on it now, but I certainly didn't start out that way.
Yeah, none of us do, right? That's why we lean on people like yourself. So you mentioned leaders that are effective are great storytellers. And we all want to think of ourselves, or at least that we're becoming a better leader or more effective leader. I bet storytelling is not often part of that thought process of becoming that great leader. But I love that you said that. And why? Why should leaders be able to tell stories well? Speak through that effectiveness a little bit.
Yeah, I mean, there are probably dozens of reasons. I'll give you a handful of them. The most important one, I think, is that human beings don't make decisions the way we'd like to think that we do. We'd like to all think that we're these rational, logical creatures that completely analyze every situation and make the most smartest decision. And I suppose sometimes we do that. But it turns out much of the cognitive research in this area tells us that many times, if not most times, human beings make subconscious, emotional, sometimes irrational decisions in one place in their brain. And then they justify those decisions rationally and logically a few nanoseconds later in a different place in the brain. And so we leave a decision-making process only aware of that logical processing part of the decision, but completely unaware of the emotional subconscious part of the decision because it's subconscious. So by definition, we're not aware of it. And so it turns out if you want to influence what people think and feel and do, in other words, leadership, it turns out you need to talk to both parts of the brain. And stories are just uniquely well qualified to reach that subconscious, emotional processing part of the brain that all of our rational thoughts and logic and dictums tend to not reach very well. So it really is because it's a better tool to help people make decisions. And that ultimately is your job as a leader, is getting people to make different decisions than they were going to make otherwise. But there's some other reasons as well. Storytelling is timeless. It seems to have always worked and always will. It's not some management fad that will come or go. It also seems to be demographic proof. I mean, I've taught this course all over the world, and I've yet to meet a demographic profile of audience member who's immune to the effects of a good story. Whereas there are different management techniques work well with different people, but storytelling just seems to work with everybody. It's also contagious. You tell a good story and it'll travel on its own by word of mouth, right? I'll tell you, you'll tell her, she'll tell him, it just kind of travels. But your policy memos probably don't do that, right? Your emails probably don't do that. The speech you gave at the last Christmas party probably won't do that. But you tell a good story and it just travels on its own. I think you want your leadership message to have those kind of attributes. One other I would share is that, just again, from a cognitive science point of view, stories literally help people remember things better. So this list that I'm giving you right now, my guess is by this time tomorrow, you're not going to remember it, but if I had already told you a great story, there's probably a story that I told you at one of those conferences you went to that you probably still remember today. But this list I'm giving you right now, you probably won't remember. But stories, I think, if I remember the studies correctly, stories make facts between 6 and 22 times more likely to be remembered if those facts are embedded in a story than if they're just given to people in a blank list, right? So stories just help people remember. And so if you want people to remember your messages as a leader, and the stories are a great way to get them to do that.
Awesome. Well, today we want to help you, the listener, and myself to dive in to storytelling. Yesterday, we covered some of why that's so important, even 10 different examples of stories that every leader should know or kind of have in their tool belt to tell. And today we want to help you think through and that structure of a story. And Paul's going to help us to do just that. So Paul, thank you again for your time. I cannot thank you enough. But how can a story structure help craft just a better story? Oftentimes we're asked a question, we kind of fumble through our words, right? I've done it so many times that way. But thinking through that structure, get us started.
Yeah. So, that's exactly why it helps. I mean, that moment where you want to tell the story and you're fumbling through your words and not knowing exactly where to start and when to stop and what to say next. That's awkward, right? That's clearly not the best delivered story, is one that just fumbles its way through. So having a structure just makes it easier for the storyteller, the leader, to tell the story, because they know exactly how they're going to tell the story. And they don't have to just make it up as they go along and fumble through their words. But the other reason I think it's important to have a structure is if you think about the great stories you've heard compared to the awful stories that you've heard, the awful stories tend to just be a rambling run-on mess. I don't think you want your story to sound that way. Now, there are lots of different story structures that you could use. And in fact, I studied as many of them as I could in doing the research for it. And you've heard of several of these, and you probably studied them yourselves. In fact, when you were probably in the third grade and you did your first book report, do you remember the structure that the teacher taught you to do your oral presentation of the book report, or of any little speech that you gave? There was the very first structure we're ever taught.
I don't. I wish I did.
Okay, level say it and see if you remember this. So introduction, body, conclusion.
That's right.
Right?
Yeah.
And then they had the way that they would tell you to remember that was tell them what you're going to tell them what you told them. Right? Introduction, body, conclusion. And if you're doing a book report, that still works. That's a great structure, but that's a terrible structure for a story. And this is another reason why leaders need a structure for stories, is because the ones that we've been taught in the past for various things, like making a presentation, don't work really well. Okay. So making a presentation is not the same as telling a story. So as an adult, we still kind of follow that introduction, body, conclusion. If you're going to make a recommendation, you got a presentation to give, you get up in front of the audience, you got your PowerPoint slides behind you. First thing you do is, here's my recommendation. And then I'm going to go through all the reasons why. That's why I'm recommending the board of directors adopt this new whatever, which is kind of like that introduction, body, conclusion. And at the end, you're going to remind them, here's what I want you to do. I want you to sign here, decide this, or fund this, or whatever. Again, that works great if you're making a presentation or a recommendation. But can you imagine a story that worked that way? Well, I'm going to tell you up front, the boat sinks. Okay. Now I'm going to tell you the whole story, or, I'm going to tell you who got murdered. And then I'm going to tell you, stories don't work that way. Stories have a very different structure. And there are a lot of story structures that will work. And the ones that your audience most likely have heard of is the hero's journey storytelling structure, because it's one that the Hollywood uses a lot. But the problem is it's like a 17-step plot structure. And that's just the plot. There's a lot of other things that have to happen before the plot, and then learning the lesson afterwards and making a recommendation. That's just the plot. So if you're going to try and tell a story, and do you remember how long the story should be? How many minutes?
Like 2 or 3 minutes.
Yeah. From our conversation yesterday, 2, 3, 4 minutes, right? You don't have time for Joseph Campbell's 17-step hero's journey storytelling structure, right? Plus, it's just too hard to remember. So that's probably not a good one. You need a short one, but the introduction, body, conclusion is not helpful enough, and it's really not the right order. So what you need is something in between those two. And what I found works the best, and I'll give you 2 ways to remember it. One is the more academic structure, which is, first of all, a hook. You need to get people's attention. Then you go through the main part of the story, which is the context, challenge, conflict, resolution. All right. There's also going to be a lesson and a recommended action at the end. But what I found in teaching this is that using the more academic sounding parts of a story is more difficult for people to remember and harder for them to know, well, what goes in what part. So what I found to be the easiest is just that there are 8 questions your story needs to answer. And if you answer these 8 questions in this order, a story will emerge in a way that makes sense to the audience and will be effective for you, the leader. All right. So here are those 8 questions. First of all, why should I bother listening to the story? Right? You got to give your audience a reason to listen to you, or they may not. Okay. Once you've done that adequately, and I can give you some tips on how to do that in a minute. Once you've done that, you've kind of earned the right to answer the next 5 questions. And those are the main part of the story. All right. So here those are. Where and when did it take place? Who's the main character and what did they want? What was the problem or opportunity they ran into? What did they do about it? And how did it turn out in the end? Right. Now, those should sound like the natural flow of a story, because, of course, it is the natural flow of a story. But if you're keeping track, that's only 6. So there are 2 more. What did you learn from the story? And what do you think I should go do now? Right. Those are questions 7 or 8. So if you'll notice, that first question is just your opportunity to get the audience's attention. The next 5 questions actually tell the story. And then the last 2 questions are where you drive some action with the story. So What was the lesson you learned? And therefore, what should you go do now? The recommended action. So that's kind of the flow that a leader should tell a story. Now, if you're just telling a story around the campfire to entertain people, well, you don't need question number 1, and you sure don't need question 7 or 8. You just tell the 5 in the middle. You just tell the story, right? But if you're telling a story in business, you need to do both of those things. You need to get their attention at the beginning because they might not listen to you if you don't. And you need to drive some action at the end. So those are the 8 questions. Yeah. So it's really just a sentence or two where you're letting the audience know that if they will listen to you for the next 2 or 3 or 4 minutes, they're going to learn something that's important to them, not to you, but to them. So if somebody comes to you with a problem, you could just say, yeah, you know what? Here's what you got to do. You got to do this, this, and this, and that'll solve your problem. That's what a typical boss would do, right? And that's good. Just sometimes you need to give people clear direction. But if you want to use a story to help them understand the right thing to do, you might get their attention or get them to want to listen to your story by saying, yeah, that is a tough problem. Let me tell you what I did 5 years ago when I had your job and I ran into the same problem. Okay. And then tell your story, right? That 1 or 2 sentences, what that lets them know is that, oh my gosh, this person used to have my job and they ran into the same problem that I'm having right now. And they're about to tell me what happened. And that's all they know. They don't know. Notice they don't know whether you succeeded or failed at solving the problem, but it doesn't matter because they're going to learn something important either way. They're either going to learn a way to not handle the situation because what you did failed miserably and almost got you fired, or they're going to learn, oh yeah, he did this and it worked. So that's what I'm going to do. All they know is that you have been in their shoes and you're about to tell them your experience. Everybody wants to hear that story. Everybody wants to hear the story about somebody who was in their shoes facing the same problem that they're facing right now. That is the most helpful type of story you could ever tell someone. And those few words at the beginning just lets them know that the story that's about to follow is one of those type of stories. But again, I'm not going to tell you whether I succeeded or failed. I'm not going to tell you what my conclusion was. I'm not going to tell you how I solved the situation. You have to listen to the story to learn those things. All I'm letting you know up front is that's the kind of story you're about to hear, because the goal of the hook, the goal of that first question is to get them to want to listen to your story. That's all it is. And that is the simplest way to do it.
Paul, welcome back to the show. Honored to have you on and be able to do a segment of shows with you so we can dive into this important topic of storytelling so we can all become more effective leaders. Thank you, Paul. Welcome back.
Yeah, thanks for having me back. I'm just starting to get the hang of this now.
That's great. This is great. No, it's such an important thing. I know this personally, but I have personally not spent enough time on it. I know there's specific stories I have spent time on where if I'm speaking in front of a large group, that's helped me tremendously. But so I know the value, but I've got to spend some time on it. So for other contexts, other stories, and you've made a great list for us to break that down so it doesn't seem maybe as daunting for us to get started. Well, there's also a ton of storytelling techniques that I know you're an expert in that is going to help us in a big way. And let's dive in there today. And again, I want to encourage the listeners, go back and listen to the last couple of days. Paul has broken down the importance of storytelling to become an effective leader, and even 8 questions that you should ask as you're thinking through the structure of your story. But let's dive in. And what makes one a natural storyteller? Are there natural storytellers? Or maybe if people say, oh, they're a natural salesman, or they're a whatever. Is that true? Or what do you think, Paul?
Oh, yeah, I'm sure there are, but I'm definitely not one of them. Which is why I think I told you a couple of days ago, I spent a long time trying to research and figure out how to do stories because they just didn't come naturally to me. But the good news is what I found out was that storytelling is learnable. It's definitely an art. It's not a science, but you can learn it. So just like if you wanted to learn how to play the guitar or the piano or learn to paint with pastels or something, that may not be your natural gift, but take a class, read a book, watch some videos, spend some time with somebody who does it. You can definitely learn these techniques.
Yeah, that's helpful to know, right? I can do it, and no doubt about it. We can all learn. And I think it's the time, right? We're going to have to spend the time to figure out. You've walked us through these 10 different types of stories and 8 questions to ask. And so how does maybe when does a story fit into this process, whether it's sales or in our case, we're talking to investors or maybe to our team and thinking about when do we fit a story in? Or are there better times?
Yeah. So some people say if you got a meeting or a speech, you kick it off with a good story or close it with a good story. And those are true. The beginning and the end are certainly good times to tell a story because the audience tends to remember. Somebody had done this research about what parts of a conversation or a speech or presentation do people remember the most. And it's typically the beginning, the end, and the high point, the most memorable or the most emotionally salient point. So yeah, you want your presentations to kind of start and end with a story would be great. But the more important place to put the story is where it just fits in the conversation. So I wouldn't overthink it and draw, well, I've got to have one at the beginning. I got to have one at the end. I mean, just put them where they belong. And oftentimes you can't even predict that because it just happens in conversation, right? Somebody brings up a problem that they're having. And if you've had experience with that problem before, well, that's a great time for you to share the story of, yeah, I had that problem a few years ago when I was in that job. Here's what I did. Okay, now you told them a story. You weren't planning on telling the story, but the time came. So I think the unplanned moments are even more important than the planned ones.
Yeah. I feel like stories doesn't have much weight if the listener doesn't trust you. Right. Often it seems, or they're probably not even going to be listening hardly if they don't have some trust or expectation of trust or something. What makes someone trust the storyteller? And we talked a little bit yesterday about those first couple questions, but what build credibility or trust?
Yeah, I guess so. Two or three things come to mind. First of all, just earning trust with somebody, if they've just met you, people naturally don't trust people they don't know. Okay, that's just a human fact of nature, right? And the other side of that coin is we naturally trust people who we know until they give us a reason not to, right? So just knowing somebody personally moves them into our circle of trust. All right. So how do you get to know somebody or how do you let somebody get to know you? And the answer is, well, you can either spend 6 or 12 months working with them, which just takes a long time, or you can tell them some personal stories about you. And for whatever reason, people, well, now that I've heard a few personal stories about you, I kind of feel like I know you personally. You automatically get inside that circle of trust. Now you need to stay there. To stay there, you need to not violate that trust, but it gets you in that circle much quicker, just sharing personal stories. So the storytelling as a technique actually does earn you some trust. Okay. But in the story itself, so whether you've done that or not, when you find yourself telling a story, the thing that earns credibility is that question number 2 that I think we talked about yesterday. Where and when does the story take place? If you tell them exactly where and when the story takes place, when I was 18 years old in Poughkeepsie, New York, blah, 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 blah. Okay. All right. So now they know exactly where and when the story takes place, which communicates to most people that this is a true story that I can believe, because obviously you've done your research. You know exactly where and when it happened, which is more effective than saying, now, this is a true story, which just sounds kind of defensive. In fact, I think when people say that, it makes it sound less believable when they say, oh, this is a true story. Well, okay, I guess I'll just trust you. But if you tell them, look, this is exactly where and when this happened, I've done my research, that makes it believable. It lends credibility to it, which lends trust to you as the speaker.
Yeah, and speak to the element of surprise or element of the unknown, and does it make stories more compelling? How do you feel about that?
You need to have it. I mean, a surprise is, of course, the movies we watch and the books we read, you love a surprise ending because it makes the story more fun. But even for leadership stories, it's an important component, but not just because it makes it more fun, even though it does that too. It's important for a leadership story because it literally, physiologically, makes the story more memorable. And here's why. It turns out the way the human brain forms memories, it's not instantaneous like a digital camera. It turns out it works more like old-fashioned film cameras that you're probably too young to remember. But you'd have to take a picture and take the film to the film store, and they develop it in the dark room. And there's a period of time after something happens where the story is kind of being developed in your memory. And it can be just from a few seconds to a few minutes to a few hours sometimes after something happens. And that period of time is called the memory consolidation period. That's what psychologists call it. And during that period of time, the memory is vulnerable to being forgotten. First of all, like if, you're in a car accident or have a sports injury and you get your head hit and you get a concussion, what happens to people's memory when they get a concussion?
Forget.
They lose it. It's not uncommon for somebody to wake up in the hospital and go, oh, how did I get here? Oh, you're in a car accident. Don't you remember? No, I don't remember. It's very typical. The reason is because the memory of that car coming at them was in the memory consolidation period being developed when the impact happened. So it interrupted it. So it never finished. Therefore, the memory was lost. Now, the good news is if there's something that can interrupt the memory consolidation process, there's something that can enhance it too. There's several things that do that. One of them is caffeine in your morning coffee. But another thing that does that is adrenaline. The kind of adrenaline that gets released in your system naturally when you get frightened or surprised. So a surprise literally, physiologically makes the story you're telling more memorable. And if it's more memorable, people are more likely to act on it for longer, and it's more likely to be a more effective leadership communication tool for you. So surprises play a very pragmatic role in your storytelling.
Interesting. Yeah. And it seems like I don't know how I was thinking about this coming up with a surprise versus, it being so expected, whatever the theme of the story. I feel like often, like you talked about a couple of times, somebody coming to you, I've got this problem. And you say, well, when I did this, you go through this story of how you took, that happened to you when you were in that position. It's going to be hard, I feel like, to create the element of surprise, or is it?
You'd think so, but there are actually techniques to do it. Folks in Hollywood figured this out a long time ago, and we can use some of the same techniques they do. So, the easier ones are if you've got a surprise somewhere in the story, you can choose where to put it. If you want it at the beginning to get their attention, you can put it there and then kind of use flashback like they do in Hollywood to then go back and tell the story up to that point. But if you think there's no surprise in your story, you actually can create one. So I'll give you the easiest technique to do this. I'll give you an example of it, and then I'll explain how it worked. You may remember this from the class a few months ago. So there's a young boy named James, right? 9-year-old kid. He's in the kitchen with his mom and his mom's sister. And while mom and auntie are sitting at the kitchen table having a cup of tea, James is standing at the stove watching the tea kettle boil. And he's just fascinated with it, right? He's watching the jet of steam come out of the tea kettle, and he's got a spoon. He holds it up there into the jet of steam and watches his little drops of water condense on the spoon, and they trickle down and they drip into a cup he's got sitting there so he doesn't make a mess in his mom's kitchen. And he's just watching the cycle go over and over and over again, just fascinated with it. Well, eventually his mother gets a little frustrated with him, and she kind of barks at him. She's like, James, go outside, read a book, do your homework, ride your bike, do something. Aren't you ashamed of yourself? You're literally staring at the tea kettle boiling for like an hour now. That's weird, Well, fortunately, young James was undaunted by that admonition, because 20 years later, in the year 1765, James Watt reinvented the steam engine, ushering in the Industrial Revolution that we, of course, all benefit from today, and all based on that fascination with steam that he developed at the age of 9 in his mother's kitchen. Now, to you, since you've heard that story before, it probably wasn't a surprise, but to your audience members who haven't heard that story, it was probably a surprise that turned out to be James Watt, the guy that invented the steam engine. And why was it a surprise? Here's the technique. Because I didn't tell you his last name and the year. So there it is. The technique is I took one or two small but vital pieces of information that belonged at the beginning of the story, and I didn't give them to you until the end of the story. Presto, surprise ending. Now, you can't just reverse the story around, that you're violating the structure. But notice, so question number 2 was, where and when did it happen? Well, I didn't ignore that question. I told you it happened in mom's kitchen. Where? I didn't tell you when. I didn't give you the year. Okay, the third question is, who's the main character? I didn't just ignore that question. I told you, James. I didn't tell you James Watt, right? So
who invented the steam engine?
Exactly. You have to answer some of the question, or the audience gets confused and you're kind of violating your storytelling contract with them. But find part of the question to leave unanswered and don't answer it until the end. And you just created a natural surprise in the story. You can do it with almost any story.
Thank you for being with us again today. I hope that you have learned a lot from the show. Don't forget to like and subscribe. I hope you're telling your friends about the Real Estate Syndication Show and how they can also build wealth in real estate. You can also go to lifebridgecapital.com and start investing today.